Hello, and welcome to my feedback to your group video and first Google Hangout for Kristen, Shawn, and Cinthia. First of all, let me start by saying that I did enjoy the format in which you ran the session, and everybody was prepared and you divided the questions, and you had a good pace and good moderation and good participation of everyone. So I did like the organized and well covered discussion. So there were three sections to your discussion, and you started out with Cinthia talking about the short-term recovery versus long-term recovery, and having a little discussion on differences and which one was more difficult to achieve and why. So some of the obvious comments that you had was that short-term recovery sometimes was sort of concurrent with response efforts, because as the response is going on, there are already some restoration of lifelines that have to take place, and the recovery is that short-term recovery about the basic restoration of lifelines. So be it your temporary housing, or having people dislocated, or allowing for provision of food, immediate healthcare needs. And so I do like the 4 phases of emergency management, being planning, response, recovery, and mitigation. But sometimes we tend to be in emergency managers tend to be too rigid, trying to figure out where one phase starts and the other phase begins. And often those areas are very fluid or even intersecting. And just case in point on that, and we didn't really discuss this, but take mitigation, for example. The response time and immediate recovery are often perfect and often missed opportunities to start thinking about mitigation practices. Because as much as a recovery is a long-term process, and generally the long-term recovery has moved way beyond response, where all response activities have ceased, and you have new events, and sometimes the long-term recovery takes years. But also, so mitigation falls after the recovery on the emergency management cycle if you were thinking about it chronologically. But in reality, mitigation efforts, particularly as far as policy, would benefit from harnessing people's emotions, people activity during the response phase in the initial short-term restoration of lifelines, when the media attention is very focused on what's going on the ground. And because the media attention is focused and public attention is focused, and you had a really good discussion on how that public attention wanes and goes off the cliff pretty much, and Shawn had a really good discussion about that. So as the media attention wanes, so decreases the pressure on policymakers. So in a policy formation window, that window is also short for the will. And so again, my point here is that those phases are fluid. They do intersect, and sometimes we do a disservice to the study of emergency management. We're trying to be very bureaucratic and say, this is that phase, and this is that phase, and this is that phase. So I think that your comments on the response and recovery bleeding over to one another is a very astute observation. And I also think that the planning obviously immediately takes place for after action reporting, and those mitigation practices are often put to the side. So as much as we talk about long-term recovery being at that very end of people's memory span, mitigation is even further removed. And some would argue, some scientists and researchers would argue whether mitigation is even part of emergency management per se. And I would like to think that it is, and it should be, and it must be, and particularly after Harvey, mitigation is key to ensuring that the response is going to be shorter, that the disaster phase is going to be shorter, and that the restoration is going to be quick, and the recovery does not have to take years, because that return to normalcy that you discussed, or healing process of a community or long-term recovery, unfortunately takes years because of the way we have done things or haven't done things in a mitigation process after previous disasters. So I want you to think about that. I want you to think, you had the course on disaster recovery framework, and I want you to think about mitigation and about particularly the politics of mitigation, and where and how mitigation strategies could be thought about already at that process of restoration of lifelines and thinking about long-term recovery, because I think that mitigation and recovery should go hand in hand. They are oftentimes should be parallel processes. So if we have a recovery pushed over, long-term recovery to sort of, end of a line, then what about mitigation? And, this might be a philosophical question, but it's definitely a question of practice for emergency management. So why is long-term recovery difficult to achieve, and why is it more challenging? Because Cinthia and you all agreed that it is more challenging because of some of those factors that you mentioned, that the memory is short. And I think Kristen said that long-term memory for people, people move on, people have to function, people go to work. Some people work through the crisis and really don't have a luxury of recovery because they are moving to the next crisis. With emergency management in larger entities, let's say Harris County, Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, there is now a function of a recovery specialist. So as much as you have planners and you have plans, there is now an entire function for the recovery process. And this is an emergency management, that person that is going to have a totally different expertise from the risk assessment person, from vulnerability assessment person. Not totally different, but certain areas are not identical. So this is talking to totally different businesses. This is processing totally different type of paperwork. This is, dealing with agencies like FEMA for small business administration, local committees and planners, architects, housing specialists. So it is definitely a distinct set of skills that, if you think about 254 counties in Texas alone, not every county is Harris County. And a lot of times emergency managers are double, triple, quadruple hatted. So they have different public service functions, and emergency management might be just one of them. So there might not be enough resources there to create that function. However, something that really stuck out to me in your discussion was that you focus on the fact that it has to be named. The process has to be named. The recovery process has to be named. And I think we had a paradigm shift after Sandy. The superstorm Sandy really brought to light the recovery. You have looked in your readings that the recovery was barely mentioned by name. Obviously, it was happening. It has been happening for 100 years of our experiences, or more than 100 years of our experiences with disasters. But it hasn't specifically been named, labeled, separated, And I'm not saying in separating it in that cycle, to create false divisions, but it definitely has that unique anatomy that is different from response, that is different from planning. And in some ways, it's different from mitigation. So I think you're right in the sense that our discourse and our narrative around the policymaking and public administration should be on talking about it. And talking about it, as you said, is hard because of psychological impacts of disasters and because of the human nature, and you mentioned that events that we respond to get captured by the media. And when they happen in a community, they cause our emotions to get very accentuated. And so spontaneous volunteers that show up, the businesses, and there is that window where everybody is really committed to helping or supporting or lending their talents. And then things go to normal for most people. They've got to go back to work. They have to, they have to their businesses and their families. And the media, of course, moves to the next thing. And so I call it the 15 minutes photo app. Who do you see when the response is going on? You see everybody. You see the governor, you see FEMA representatives, you see senior leaders in a community, you see spiritual leaders, obviously you see leaders in public service and emergency responders. And as that event goes over to short-term or towards the long-term recovery, that picture becomes a picture of the victim with their issues, the agency with their problems of reconstruction. And this is where the hurdle and bureaucratic processes start. And we are not doing enough in that area to keep it at the forefront, of the news, to keep it at the forefront of literature, to keep it at the forefront of interest stories. So people don't know, and it's harder to rally that support or create that support because you reached a certain burnout on the event. So that's that part about recovery, from the psychological standpoint. I just talked to a assistant of the Sheriff Gonzalez in Harris County, and Debbie Schmidt, who is a good friend of mine. And she shared with me that today, almost a year after Hurricane Harvey, the Harris County Jail still farms out services to private contractors and other entity from mutual aid in Louisiana. The court is barely functioning. The court was not functioning for several weeks, and third and fourth floors are operating at some level, but a lot of those cases are hanging, and the court actually is hanging by the thread in Harris County to remain operational. And we're talking about almost a year after the hurricane. So we don't know those stories. They are not, again, on the far front. And in larger jurisdictions and in larger counties, you might have groups of people in emergency management specifically that are trying to make some headway in that. But definitely, this is one area that does need research, and one area that does need constant labeling and putting it up front. So I'm really glad that you brought it out in that discussion, and I want you to think about those strategies. The other thought that I had about talking about people dispatching and volunteers dispatching. Shawn, you discussed the fact that when things happen in where you are in Bryan College Station, you had everybody. You had air support, you had military, you had emergency response organizations that were ready to help and on the moment's notice, and they were going to help the victims of Harvey. And of course, right now, very few people talk about Harvey recovery. So that's something that I came across my research on Harvey, where I have spoken with a lot of first responders who are saying, we had so many spontaneous volunteers. We had people coming, from everywhere and trying to help. And after a while, they became a liability. And there is that sense in response organizations that, the volunteers, they need to be certified, they need to be trained, they don't know what they're doing, they are a hindrance, they become a liability because they come without food and without shelter, and, eventually they stress the response organization. And I think that we perhaps might start to think about it differently, because if we do have such a tremendous ability of people to rally around a certain issue, and if they internalize it and make it their own, then they can be thought about as a resource, not just in the response phase, but if you're having those volunteers that are edusing and they are becoming an annoyance, because some of the people I've talked to talked about, a burden of spontaneous volunteers, then how about thinking about strategies, how to sell to those volunteers, or how to impart on those volunteers the value of their work at a later stage? Because it's sort of, I think about it a little bit like with a baby shower. With a baby shower, everybody buys gifts from 0 months to 3 months. They are cute, they are tiny little outfits for those infants, and people get, all the outfits 0 to 3 months. And then 3 to 6, 6 to 12, a lot of you do birthday parties. But typically this is, what we tend to focus on. So our thinking, our practical thinking about that has to change. We have to change. In order to change things, we have to think differently. So what kind of strategies do we promote to garner or leverage that initial zeal of a community and keep it at the forefront? And I think that should be the preoccupation of researchers and preoccupation of policymakers and certainly emergency managers. I appreciated your points on continuity of operation planning, and Kristen had quite a bit to say about that, specifically as it relates to the continuity of operation planning for her agency and for her workplace, and some good reflections there on all those different issues, and specifically communications. And you mentioned communications, and you talked about unfortunate loss of a first responder during Harvey, Sergeant Perez, and how it's very difficult to plan for those redundancies and other physical structures where you can move all the records and where you have redundant technologies. This is really high cost. But I think the important thing is that you do think about it. And I did like the example that Shawn provided, where Shawn, you discussed how you have, I believe, monthly drills on moving dispatch, and actually going through that process, how it would look. And this is a really good example of building resiliency, building redundancy, building in some sort of redundancy or alternative solutions. Now, it might not be exactly the same location, because of course those events will always throw the king your way. So, you plan this route and suddenly the route is gone. But the fact that you think about it creates certain adaptability. And when you look at the Ross model of adaptive capabilities and improvisation, innovation, flexibility in the response phase, the more you think through those issues, the more your situational awareness increases, and you have those building cognitive blocks to sort of connect the dots. I mean, it's as simple as that. If you don't talk about something, then you don't really process it in your mind. And some solutions are not going to be the same solutions, but you do have that toolbox of thinking differently. of having more flexibility in your thinking. So I think, and that goes certainly to another part of our course on exercise design, on simulations, on tactical decision-making games, and all those things around the decision-making. But the decision-making and situational awareness certainly get enhanced by trying to build in alternative systems or alternative pathways. So I did enjoy that part of your conversation on continuity of operation planning. And certainly for a lot of agencies, it's an exercise in futility that they do check the checklist, or just like with emergency operation plans, import ready templates, and just because they're supposed to have a continuity of operation plan, where it's really not about the plan as much as it is about the process of identifying people who might be helpful, identifying businesses that could be useful, identifying logistical equipment or communications, or alternative communications, or backup systems that could be helpful, cloud computing and things like that, which I'll get to Shawn's point on virtual systems that we had in the technology article. Something Kristen brought about a discussion on, and I think that was in your discussion about the network for integrating private and public businesses to share damage assessments and share resources and finding alternative routes for short and long-term recovery. And in the process of this conversation, you mentioned something that an application that was used in Harvey. I think Kristen brought it out. And I believe you might have been referring to Zello, although I'm not sure if this is exactly the same application that you were discussing. I know that Zello was used by the Cajun Navy, and it was used by the Coast Guard. It got picked up by some of the police dispatch and emergency response dispatch. Of course, it's really hard to figure out exactly, what was the scope of its use and who used it and how. But this is an example of something that we probably are going to see more and more, specifically in that response and restoration of lifelines phase from now on, with those high magnitude events, is the spontaneous and organic solutions by citizens and systems that are either created ad hoc or they are off-the-shelf simple solutions. And so while we're having this big discussion on the information network that was suggested in your reading, and you had some positive comments about it, all the technical sides aside, but concerns. Shawn, your concerns were about your concerns were more around the robustness of the system, I think, because when we're talking about resiliency, those key words come up. One is robustness, the other one is redundancy, where robustness is the really large capacity to do something, and redundancy refers to alternative ways of doing something, and that certainly increases the resilience and helps the system somehow coast through that event, maybe not at the optimal functioning, but at the satisfying functioning. So you referred to the robustness of its system, that is not very robust, potentially, because it depends on, one factor failing, and possibly to the fact that it might not be able to be supported by redundancies the way it is designed. And that's certainly a very good observation, that perhaps in that restoration phase, the short-term phase, that system is not very feasible. I mean, it looks good in to start building something around it, that maybe it's more feasible in a long-term recovery. My other thoughts on that are that when you bring a private sector and public sectors together, there are a lot of issues around information sharing. That dreaded word about information sharing. Obviously, businesses have proprietary information that, for a variety of different reasons, they might not be able to put out there into the system like that. It affects their legal procedures and legal laws, and their legal counsel or advisors, would advise against joining something like that unless the government can create safeguards for it. And obviously that would be, without some kind of regulation, very difficult to achieve. And that certainly creates a much more structured and bureaucratic process again. So contribution to such system would have to be almost not structured, but quite organic, like a marketplace of willing people. And it is labor intensive. So then, because it is labor intensive, you were thinking more it would have to be structured to designate who would be responsible for it. So it sort of, puts us in this quandary on, a lot of issues, political issues, information sharing issues, patents, protection of, certain information, let's say with businesses that are, nursing homes, or, they're bound by HIPAA laws and things like that. So when I say all that because I wanted to foreground my observations about Zella. So the application that Kristen mentioned, I have come across in my research on Harvey, and I might have discussed that with you, on a solution that came out organically, and many of them do. And I think that we are reaching that new paradigm that they are ad hoc, spontaneous, emergent solutions that you don't plan for, that happen, and they mirror almost sort of the ecology of living systems, and biological world, and have some foundations. The emergence has foundations in science, but that emergence is very well illustrated by the company that I came across that's called Crowdsource. And the Crowdsource, which is run by Matthew Marcetti in Houston, and you might have heard of him. He was on the news. I got to know him very well. I interviewed him in depth on his on what he did during Harvey. And what Crowdsource was, it was a simple solution that was posted on the internet. That was a call for people in affected areas by Harvey during the beginning of the disaster phase, which there was another issue, naming the time period between the emergency and the disaster, and nobody really was able to determine that. It sort of happened. So when you think about all those different phases, that's another example of how fluid those things are. That in emergency, when does it become disaster? How do you know it? That was a big issue. That was a big issue for fire marshal's office, for fire departments, and that participated. But going to Marcetti and Crowdsource, he knew very well that he was from within the community. He was biking the area, and he's an IT specialist, and he's done a lot of work with GIS and mapping and real estate and things like that. So he's an independent business owner with very strong IT experience. And he put in a website where he had on one side people to sign up if they needed a rescue, and on the other side, touching them with people in the zip codes that might be interested in helping those who put the information out there that they need the rescue. His database from Harvey contains 4,700 records of people that specifically wrote that they needed rescue. If you multiply it by an average, and he did that based on the average of 4 people per household, he came to a conclusion that it was about 20,000 contacts or 20,000 people that expressed the need to be rescued in Harvey. And this was certainly not a perfect solution. There are a lot of issues with that Matthew is facing with the crowdsource, particularly now. Of course, he was terrified because this thing grew beyond his imagination. He never planned for it to be designed for what it did, but it was a very simple solution, and it emerged and it grew, and he had at some point no control of its growth, to the point where it got synced with Zello, and it got synced with other groups that started opening, groups like victim assistance organizations, nonprofits, that switched their operations from normal duties to actually becoming call centers. And all those things organically synced. And again, Coast Guard was relying on crowdsource very heavily. And so where other emergency responders, they might have not known that the information was coming from crowdsource, but they're certainly using it, and they were using Zello as well. So where the issue starts is when you try to codify those systems, because Matthew is now looking at, talking to emergency management organizations and researchers and looking for solutions, how to make his platform better, how to make it workable, and sort of to institutionalize it with other emergency response organizations. And he's coming across a tremendous amount of policy issues and legal issues. Just to give you a very simple example, people that were needing rescues had simple things to fill out, that he came up with, independent citizen that put something on the web. And some of those questions were about pets, and some of those questions were about health issues. Do you have a health issue? Now, if you want to codify that system now, there is the big issue around HIPAA, right? So in an organic structure like that was created by citizens, that was created by people in an hour of need, those systems came about and lifted some of the burdens of response, but then they sort of probably will become dysfunctional, or they will get morphed to the point where they become very rigid and bureaucratic, and they are becoming less robust and less redundant, and they are mirroring those other systems that are already in place, like STAR system. I don't know if you've seen the STAR, if you've seen the request for assistance that operates in Texas, but if you have ever seen that graph, I really encourage you to look at it. But the Emergency Operations Center, the request for assistance or resources from the state is multi-level process. And there is several different points where different decision makers have to sign off formally on that request. And in reality, you have to have about 20 to 30 minutes to run a request for different channels and different decision makers to get that request to state. But that 20 or 30 minutes is assuming that everybody is there doing just that. So in effect, the request system was being violated all the time in Harvey. The request for assistance, there were a lot of back channel orderings. There's a lot of people leveraging their personal connections, which is absolutely a no-no in your procedure and protocol for planning for emergency management. You're supposed to use those standard operating procedures. But yet, those standard operating procedures were being flouted by several people that I have interviewed in my research, and not just on the STAR system, but also on personal communications, on overriding lines of authority, on overriding city officials, where apparently Mayor Tanner was not willing to request the state assistance on something, and then back channels reached to Austin and were violating that formal process. And where I'm going with that is that it appears that in current landscape of disasters, the emergent solutions, emergent and spontaneous, seem to have a quite big impact on response. And I am not sure if there are ways to permanently integrate them into processes that can be replicated for a next disaster. It's one of those things where things, like phoenix with the ashes, they sort of emerge and then they die out. Now that doesn't bode well for recovery in our discussion of recovery, because it would mean that, is recovery even possible in that sense that you are developing better systems? Because, as you noted, recovery is not bouncing back to the previous state. Good recovery, healthy recovery, is looking at mitigation. That's why I said those two have to be parallel, because you don't want to go to the previous state if that state was not the ideal state. And for the most part, in Harvey, there are things that we have done over the years in building and development and urban design that were not mitigated. And so, how are we going to build differently? Are we going to have different codes? Are we talking about mitigation at that point, if we're not talking about the recovery? So now you add those systems, and are we deluding ourselves that we are creating something based on lessons learned that might not really work in the next situation? So take that and think about that with continuity of operation planning on one hand, and the emergence on the other, and the value of emergence and acceptance of emergence, because that's, I think, also a big policy issue and big organizational issue, where a lot of criticism is being directed to management of volunteers and how they need to be credentialed and how they need to be certified and how they, are not trained to do what professionals do. And yet we might have to think a little bit differently about the talent pool of people who are citizens, who are doctors, who are nurses, who are engineers, who are all those people that might be part of recovery or mitigation. If we involve them later, they do come to the game during the response phase. So certainly there are a lot of experts that are spontaneous volunteers. And I think that it takes very adaptable mindset, a new mindset in emergency management, to be very open to those ideas of, spontaneity and grassroots actions. Now the point is to continue that past response phase to recovery, to mitigation. And in week 2, you had articles to that effect on pre and post Katrina grassroots and civic engagement and community participation, which I hope forced you to deep reflection on those issues. So some other thoughts about your discussion. I think you covered the continuity of operation planning very well, with all the different elements and the difference between the emergency operation plans and continuity of operation planning. And I think that the only thing that I'm going to stress is, and you mentioned communications, but I think that with continuity of operation planning, the most important thing to keep in mind is your essential mission functions. What is the essential mission function? Because it is different for different agency and institution. And a lot of times the disaster for which you have emergency operation plans will affect the agency that does have certain mission essential functions that don't always overlap with that emergency preparedness for a disaster. So for, what are the mission essential functions for a police department? You, Kristen and Shawn can talk to that. What do you have to do to operate outside of that emergency, outside of that disaster? Because police officers, A, they are part of response. B, they can be victims. And there are scores of stories on victimization of responders who lost their homes, whose homes were flooded. But also, you also have to keep your work afloat. You answer calls. You still have calls for service. You still have crime. Research certainly supports that. Crime doesn't rise during disasters, but you still have your everyday functioning. You still investigate cases, you still have leads, you still, do all those things that you need to do. So there's almost a three-pronged approach to that. You've got an emergency for which you have an emergency operation plan that is separate. Continuity of operation planning is for your essential mission functions for you as an agency. So it's going to be different for the university, for example. I like to use the university example because it's not your typical traditional response organization. What does the university have as a mission? The university has a mission of educating. So continuity of operation planning for university is going to focus on continuance of teaching, accommodation of students that might not be living in affected areas. So on your online support, we had in Harvey, we have moved and modified online courses, and there were some classes where a lot of students were not from Houston area. So they were not particularly interested in taking a different path or a different semester design because they were not affected. And the essential mission of an educational institution is to continue education, right? This is tuition pays functioning of a university to some degree. So, and then you have research, and then you have faculty, and then you have, all that. And at the same time, you might be affected by the disaster, by the emergency. So for that, you have an emergency operation plan. Who do you call? Where do you stage? Where do you shelter? How do you feed? When do you resume class? Those are more emergency or disaster management issues. Your continuity of operation planning is, what do you do with those students in those other cities? What do you do for the records? What do you do to continue the executive body making decisions, sometimes legal decisions, from now forth for the institution? So in that sense, continuity of operation planning, I think gets strengthened by emergency operation plans, because a lot of those areas like communications and redundant communications and things like that will overlap. But it's the goal that's a little bit different. And so, and the reason I'm talking about it is because for each organization or institution, the first question to address in continuity of operation planning, to avoid using templates of other institutions, which happens a lot, just like it happens with safety plans and emergency operation plans, is a question of why. Why are we doing what we're doing? And what are we doing? What is our mission? What things do we have to continue doing in order to exist, to still have the same profile as an agency or institution after the event? And then, Kristen brought a story that I found extremely compelling and sad, perhaps, but quite the norm in disaster management. The story of a Greek restaurant that certainly was not resilient enough to withstand the event of this magnitude. And you will find that most of small businesses in the United States cannot stay open. And you've read the article on that, when they cannot restore within a certain period of time, and definitely a month is pretty much a death sentence for a large number of them. So because they don't have capital, because they don't have redundancies built in, and because they're not robust enough. So at some point, those things do not come back to the landscape. And then with that, what comes to mind with a particular restaurant is the symbolism of recovery and the healing aspect and the psychological aspect. That is a hole in that community, because this was a community bonding place. As you looked at the social capital, you talked about bonding, bridging, and linking. And with the bridging and linking being, a little higher level, with linking being the highest because it goes to the external elements. And that community, might be bonded, and, they are bridging, but at some point there are no external resources that are going to be dedicated to that element of the community to be restored. And so those things have a tremendous toll. And in a recovery phase, particularly when one moves to mitigation, I think those are very important discussions to have, as Kristen mentioned, because people miss things. People can feel the absence of certain things that were familiar in a community, and it can have an impact. So in any redesign of the community, in any restoration, a discussion about the Greek mom and pop place, I think is very appropriate by the community. What do you do to restore a certain feel, a certain climate of the community? Because it's not just all about, rebuilding the buildings. It's also bringing that feel that existed. And it was the environment where people would meet and share, and, it's, in a sense, get that bridging of a community, maybe diverse people, coming for Greek food in a particular location. So I thought there was a really interesting example. And again, when you read the pre and post Katrina article, you're going to see a lot of really hard, difficult issues that come with redesign of the community and what is important to people. One can think, for example, about the trees in Galveston that were destroyed by Ike, the oak trees, the 100 or so year oak trees that were so very important to the feel, to the climate, to something that you can't really measure, and the amounts of concrete poured, or windows installed, or electrical circuits being reinstated. So I think, again, I think that those elements of infrastructure, of physical assets and redundancy get, visible, quantifiable, like you mentioned in some of your posts, whereas those human aspects are sometimes equally important. And so I encourage you, when you think about the recovery, also think about mitigation and look at that Ross's model of resiliency, and think about the mitigation impact and how mitigation can be incorporated at many different levels, from response all the way through short-term, long-term recovery, and then only then, through feed into planning. So I wanted to thank you for your hangout, and I'm looking forward to watching the other one.